Michelle Thompson had always been determined to break barriers. As a child, she dreamed of becoming a lawyer, not just to defend those in need, but to prove that her voice mattered. Growing up in a small town, Michelle faced challenges many could never understand, but with an unshakable sense of purpose, she climbed through the ranks of the legal profession, eventually becoming president of the State Bar Association, a prestigious position she earned after years of hard work, leadership, and advocacy. Her story was one of perseverance and triumph. She had fought through bias and stereotypes to become one of the most respected figures in her field. Her colleagues admired her, and her community celebrated her as a beacon of hope for those who believed success was out of reach. But as accomplished as Michelle was, there were still those who underestimated her based on her race and gender. She knew that the path to leadership had been far from easy. Every step forward had been met with resistance from both overt prejudice and subtler doubts that questioned her abilities. At times, Michelle felt that the weight of expectation was crushing her, but she refused to let it define her. Instead, she used every challenge as fuel to keep pushing forward. When Michelle was appointed president of the State Bar Association, it was a groundbreaking moment, not only for her, but for the entire legal community. She had become one of the first Black women to hold such a prestigious position, and her appointment was seen as a symbol of progress. But Michelle knew it was only the beginning of a much larger journey. She felt a responsibility to push for change within the profession and to ensure that the legal world became more inclusive and diverse. Under her leadership, the State Bar Association launched numerous initiatives aimed at increasing opportunities for minority attorneys and advocating for greater equality within the justice system. Michelle's tenure as president was marked by tangible changes that made the legal profession more accessible to those who had long been excluded from it. Despite her success in pushing for reform, Michelle still faced the everyday challenges of being a Black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated profession. There were times when she felt that she was not taken seriously, or that her contributions were overlooked by those who held traditional power. She knew she had to work twice as hard to prove herself, but she was accustomed to that struggle. For Michelle, it was a challenge she had embraced since childhood. She remembered being one of the only Black students in her law school classes, and how she had to constantly remind her professors and classmates that she belonged. She remembered the looks of surprise when she spoke up during meetings or challenged an idea in court. The world around her was often skeptical of her abilities, but she never let it stop her. Instead, she used their doubts to fuel her ambition. Every victory in the courtroom, every case won, every new initiative launched was a small but significant triumph in a larger battle she had taken on, not just for herself, but for all the women and people of color who had been told they could not succeed in spaces that weren't made for them. Michelle's career had been one of breaking glass ceilings, but as the months and years passed, she felt that she had only just begun to make a real difference. Her leadership was paving the way for future generations of attorneys who would no longer have to face the same hurdles she had endured. She wasn't just leading the Bar Association, she was changing the face of the legal profession, one case at a time. It was on a crisp autumn morning when Michelle Thompson walked into the courthouse for what seemed like any other case. But as she crossed the threshold of the courtroom that day, she could feel a subtle tension in the air. Something was different. As the courtroom filled with murmurs of anticipation, she stood tall beside her client, ready to take on the challenge ahead. The case was a significant one, a large corporation accused of discriminatory hiring practices, and Michelle had prepared meticulously to present her argument as she always did. But what was about to unfold was something she hadn't anticipated. The judge presiding over the case was Judge Gregory Harris, a seasoned veteran in the legal world known for his no-nonsense attitude and his long career on the bench. Michelle had encountered him before in various settings, but had never been involved in a case directly before him. Today, however, she would experience him in a new light. As the proceedings began, Judge Harris quickly established his authority with a stern tone and a sharp eye toward the details of the case. Michelle listened carefully as he laid out the ground rules for the trial, but something in his demeanor seemed off to her. From the start, he was distracted, and his attention was not where it needed to be. As the trial progressed, Michelle felt the judge's eyes on her more often than usual, but not with the respect she was used to receiving. Instead, there was something dismissive in his gaze, almost as if he didn't believe she was capable of handling such a high-profile case. She chalked it up to nerves and the pressure of the case at first, but as the hearing went on, his behavior began to shift in a more troubling direction. At one point, Michelle had to pause to address a minor procedural issue, the kind of routine question any attorney might raise to ensure the case was on the right track. It was a common request, and certainly not something that would warrant much attention, but when Michelle raised the issue, Judge Harris reacted sharply. He accused her of violating a rule and fined her for the error. The fine was substantial, and the accusation was completely out of place. Michelle knew that her actions had been within the legal parameters. It was a minor technicality, nothing more, but the judge's tone suggested otherwise. "Miss Thompson, you should know better than to waste the court's time with these small mistakes," Judge Harris said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'll be fining you for this oversight." The room fell silent at his words. Michelle's heart began to race, her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to maintain her composure. This wasn't the first time she had encountered bias in the courtroom, but something about this felt different. The fine was one thing, but the way it was imposed made her feel as though her experience and reputation were being dismissed outright, as though she were a junior attorney rather than one of the most respected legal figures in the state. Her mind raced as she carefully considered her next steps, but she knew that in that moment, reacting rashly would only play into the judge's hands. Instead, she took a deep breath and responded calmly, "Your Honor, I respectfully disagree with your ruling. I believe my actions were in line with standard procedures," she said, but the judge waved her off and moved on with the case as if her words had never been spoken. As the session continued, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about the fine, it was about something much deeper, something personal. She had worked too hard and come too far to be treated this way. She wondered if the judge even knew who she was. Did he recognize that she was the president of the State Bar Association? Had he ever heard of her work in civil rights and legal reform? Or was she simply another black woman in a courtroom struggling to be seen for who she truly was? The thought lingered in her mind as the session wore on, and Michelle's confidence began to waver. She couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief that in all her years of experience and leadership, she was still being judged solely by her appearance and not by her accomplishments. After the hearing, Michelle walked out of the courthouse with a storm brewing inside her. She had maintained her composure during the session, but now that she was alone in her car, the reality of what had just happened hit her like a ton of bricks. The fine, the judge's dismissive attitude, the way he had spoken to her, all of it felt like an insult to everything she had worked for. She was no stranger to the challenges that came with being a black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated profession. But this was different. It wasn't just about being overlooked or underestimated, it was about being dismissed entirely. As she drove home that afternoon, Michelle replayed the events in her mind over and over. She tried to make sense of what had happened and why it had felt so personal to her. It wasn't the fine itself that stung, it was the way the judge had treated her, as though she was a nobody, as though her years of experience, her position as the president of the State Bar Association, and her countless contributions to the legal field meant nothing to him. The more she thought about it, the more it became clear to her that the judge's actions had nothing to do with procedure and everything to do with the fact that he didn't recognize her as someone of equal standing. For hours, Michelle pondered whether she should let it go and move on. After all, it was just one judge and one case, but deep down she knew that this moment wasn't about just one instance. It was a reflection of the broader issues that still plagued the legal world and society as a whole. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every black woman, every woman of color who had ever been overlooked or underestimated for their accomplishments. The next day, Michelle reached out to a few of her trusted colleagues in the legal field. They were stunned when they heard what had happened and immediately offered their support. Michelle had always been the one to fight for others, to be their voice when they couldn't speak for themselves. But now she found herself in need of that same support. She had never expected to be in this position, but the more she spoke to her peers, the more she realized how many of them had faced similar experiences. Instances where their authority or expertise have been questioned simply because of their race or gender. Together with her team of advisors, Michelle decided that she couldn't let this incident slide. She would file a formal complaint against Judge Harris for his behavior in the courtroom, not just because of the fine, but because of the way he had treated her with a complete lack of respect. She knew that doing so would not be easy. It would likely bring her even more scrutiny from both the legal community and the public, but Michelle had never been one to back down from a fight that was worth fighting for. She spent the next few days preparing her case, gathering evidence, and organizing her thoughts as she wrote the complaint. She made it clear that this wasn't just about a procedural error. It was about a systemic issue in the legal profession that needed to be addressed. She argued that the judge's failure to recognize her position as the leader of the State Bar Association and the disrespect he showed her was not just an oversight, but part of a broader pattern of bias against women and people of color in positions of power. While Michelle's decision to take formal action was a difficult one, she knew it was the right one. It wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure that no one else would have to endure the same treatment she had faced. It was about ensuring that the legal profession could move forward with a commitment to fairness and respect for all people, no matter their background or appearance. Michelle had always believed in justice and equality, and this was her chance to put those values into practice in a way that would benefit everyone who came after her. As Michelle prepared to file her formal complaint against Judge Harris, she was fully aware of the potential ramifications of her decision. The legal community, which had long praised her leadership, was now divided. Some of her colleagues were entirely supportive, urging her to stand firm, while others cautioned against stirring controversy, arguing that challenging a judge could damage her career. It wasn't just a matter of the fine anymore. It was about her place in a profession that had long been resistant to change. Despite the tension, Michelle knew that this was a necessary step, not just for herself, but for every marginalized person who had been overlooked or undermined within the system. It was one thing to deal with everyday bias in subtle ways. It was quite another when the disrespect came from someone in a position of power like Judge Harris. For Michelle, the case had evolved into something larger than one courtroom incident. This was a chance to expose a deep-seated issue within the legal profession: unconscious bias, gender inequality, and racial discrimination. The days following her decision to file the complaint felt like a whirlwind. Michelle spoke with her attorneys, carefully crafting a message that would both convey the seriousness of the judge's actions and highlight the importance of systemic change. She recalled the specific moments in court that left her feeling disrespected, including the way Judge Harris had dismissed her procedural question with little thought and then followed it up with the fine. More than the fine itself, it was the dismissive tone, the patronizing attitude, and the undermining of her authority that stung. She included details in her complaint to underscore the contrast between how she would have been treated if she were a white male attorney with her credentials. The media began to take notice of Michelle's case, and as the story spread, public opinion was divided. Some were quick to rally behind Michelle, calling the incident a clear example of systemic racism and sexism in the legal system. Others, however, were more skeptical, questioning whether Michelle was overreacting or if the fine was simply part of standard judicial procedure. The conversations in the media began to escalate, and soon the story was being covered by national outlets. Michelle found herself at the center of a growing debate, but she never wavered in her commitment to seeing this through. She knew that change wouldn't come easily, and she had never expected it to. The struggle for equality and respect was a long one, and she was determined to be part of the force that pushed it forward. Behind the scenes, Michelle's peers were voicing their opinions in private meetings and phone calls. A few prominent figures in the legal community were quietly urging her to reconsider, concerned that the public attention might overshadow the core issue. They feared that challenging a judge, particularly one with a long and established career, could lead to unwanted consequences. They were also concerned that her efforts to fight the fine would be framed as personal vendettas or hypersensitivity rather than a genuine pursuit of justice. Despite the pressure to back down, Michelle stayed the course. She felt compelled to do what she had always done throughout her career: fight for what was right, even if it meant standing alone. As the days passed, she began to receive messages from other women and people of color in the legal profession. messages of encouragement, solidarity, and shared experiences of feeling unseen or underestimated. Many of them had faced similar situations where their abilities or contributions had been overlooked or minimized because of their race or gender. This outpouring of support reinforced Michelle's belief that this was not just her battle. It was a collective fight for dignity and recognition in a system that often failed to acknowledge the full value of diverse leadership. Determined to see this through, Michelle continued to gather her evidence and refine her arguments. She knew the legal community was watching, but it wasn't just the legal community that was involved anymore. Her case had sparked a national conversation about discrimination in professional spaces, particularly in the fields of law and justice. Michelle's decision to take on Judge Harris was no longer just a fight for her own respect. It was a fight for all those whose voices had been silenced for too long. As the formal complaint against Judge Harris moved through the legal channels, Michelle found herself in the midst of a public firestorm. The media coverage was relentless, and opinions about her actions were split. Some saw her as a trailblazer, a fearless leader standing up against institutional biases, while others viewed her as an overzealous attorney challenging a judge for something as trivial as a procedural fine. Yet the more Michelle reflected on the situation, the clearer it became that the issue wasn't about the fine. It was about a pervasive problem that needed to be addressed head-on. In private conversations, some of her colleagues in the legal community expressed their admiration for her courage, while others advised caution. Michelle understood their concerns, but she couldn't ignore the fact that this was bigger than one judge or one courtroom incident. It was about systemic issues that had long gone unchallenged, problems that had been ignored for decades by those in power. Judge Harris wasn't the problem in isolation. It was a reflection of a legal culture that still had difficulty acknowledging the legitimacy of leadership from women and people of color. For Michelle, taking a stand was no longer a choice, it was a responsibility. As the investigation into her complaint began, more stories emerged, stories of other women and people of color in the legal profession who had experienced similar dismissals and overlooked opportunities. It became evident that Michelle's case was part of a much larger issue. From public defenders to partners at prestigious law firms, countless individuals had encountered bias in the courtroom, at the bar, and in the halls of justice. Many had never felt comfortable speaking out, fearing retribution or the tarnishing of their careers. But Michelle's decision to step into the light gave others the courage to do the same. Public opinion began to shift as more and more voices joined the conversation. Women and people of color across the country, particularly those in law, expressed their solidarity with Michelle. Her actions, once perceived as a personal dispute with a judge, were now seen as a symbol of a broader fight for equality and respect. Law firms began to take a hard look at their internal policies regarding bias and diversity. Articles were published on the subtle ways that biases impacted hiring, promotion, and professional recognition. Legal conferences included discussions on how to support marginalized attorneys, ensuring that they could excel in their careers without being held back by invisible barriers. Despite the growing support, there were still many who questioned whether Michelle was making too much of the situation. Some pundits argued that the fine was a mere technicality, a misunderstanding of procedure, and that Michelle's response was disproportionate. Yet Michelle knew that the fine was merely a catalyst for the larger issue she was raising. The fine was a small moment, but it represented an entrenched mindset that women, especially women of color, were still not given the respect they deserved, regardless of their accomplishments. Her legal team worked tirelessly to build the case against Judge Harris. They carefully examined the context of the hearing, including transcripts and the judge's previous rulings, to show a pattern of behavior that pointed to bias. The pressure mounted on the judge, who had long been seen as a respected figure in the courtroom. Many wondered how he would respond to the mounting scrutiny and whether he would acknowledge his mistake or double down on his position. Michelle remained calm throughout the entire process. She was resolute, knowing that this battle was never about personal vindication. It was about creating lasting change in a profession that needed it. She had spent years building a reputation as a leader in the legal world, and now she was using that platform to speak out about the realities of bias. She wanted to ensure that future generations of women and people of color in law would have a better experience, one where their hard work was recognized and valued without question. Through it all, Michelle began to receive letters and messages from lawyers, students, and activists thanking her for her bravery. These letters reinforced her belief that change was not only necessary but possible. Her fight had become a symbol of hope for those who had felt invisible for too long. Michelle knew that, whatever the outcome of the case, she had already won something far more important, a movement that would inspire real change in the legal profession. As the legal proceedings continued, Michelle's complaint against Judge Harris became a landmark case, drawing national attention and igniting a broader conversation about the legal profession's long-standing issues with racial and gender bias. The case had taken on a life of its own, and Michelle was no longer just fighting for her own respect. She was now an emblem of the fight for equality in the courtroom. The pressure, however, was immense. Every day felt like a balancing act between continuing her work as president of the State Bar Association, handling her legal cases, and dealing with the mounting attention surrounding the case. But Michelle remained determined, knowing that this battle, difficult as it was, had the potential to create lasting change. Behind the scenes, the legal world was starting to shift. Prominent law firms began reviewing their diversity policies, and many were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the systemic obstacles that women and minorities still faced in reaching leadership positions. Some firms quietly reached out to Michelle, acknowledging that her fight had highlighted issues that many had preferred to overlook. At the same time, other legal professionals, particularly those who had grown up with the old guard mentality, expressed their disbelief at her actions. They couldn't understand why she had chosen to challenge a judge, someone with decades of experience, when it seemed like a relatively minor issue. Despite the mixed reactions, Michelle's resolve remained unshaken. She knew that this was bigger than one judge, bigger than one courtroom. It was a struggle against the deep-rooted biases that had pervaded the profession for generations. And the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a fight for Black women or women of color. It was a fight for justice itself. The law was supposed to be a place where fairness prevailed, but the realities of racial and gender inequality had pervaded the system for far too long. As the hearing date for her case approached, Michelle's legal team worked around the clock, preparing their arguments and gathering testimonies from others who had faced similar biases in their own careers. They were careful to present the evidence in a way that highlighted the systemic nature of the problem, not just the isolated actions of one judge. They knew that Judge Harris would likely argue that his actions were not racially motivated, that he had simply made a procedural decision. But Michelle's team was confident that they could demonstrate that this was part of a broader pattern that needed to be addressed. Meanwhile, the public conversation continued to evolve. News outlets had picked up the story, and Michelle found herself increasingly in the spotlight. She was interviewed on television, featured in magazines, and invited to speak at panels and conferences. Many praised her for her courage and leadership, but others criticized her for making an example out of a judge over what they saw as a minor issue. Despite the criticism, Michelle took every opportunity to explain her position. She spoke passionately about how systemic racism and sexism were woven into the fabric of the legal profession, and how much work still needed to be done to create a level playing field for all lawyers. In one of her more high-profile interviews, Michelle was asked why she hadn't simply let the incident go, given her status and the potential fallout. Her answer was simple: if we keep letting these things slide, they will never change. If we continue to allow people in positions of power to disregard the accomplishments and expertise of others simply because of their race or gender, we are sending the message that these behaviors are acceptable. I can't stand by and let that happen. Her words resonated with many, particularly those who had faced similar struggles in their own careers. Michelle's case became not just a fight for respect, but a rallying cry for broader societal change. In workplaces across the country, conversations began to open up about how women and people of color were treated, not only in law, but in all professional fields. While Michelle's legal battle was still ongoing, it was clear that her influence was already being felt. The case had sparked a conversation about bias in the legal system that could no longer be ignored, and Michelle had become a leading voice in that conversation. The outcome of the case still hung in the balance, but Michelle knew that, win or lose, she had already made an undeniable impact. She had turned a courtroom encounter into a catalyst for change, a shift in the narrative about who truly belonged in positions of power and leadership within the legal profession. The day of the hearing finally arrived, and Michelle entered the courtroom with the same poise and professionalism she had always carried. Her legal team was ready, the evidence was prepared, and her resolve had only strengthened over the past few weeks. But as she sat down at the defendant's table, she couldn't shake the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a case about a fine. It was a moment that could alter the trajectory of her career, the legal community, and potentially affect countless others who had been treated unfairly in similar ways. Judge Harris, now well aware of the media frenzy surrounding the case, entered the courtroom with a sense of urgency. His reputation was at stake, and he had little choice but to defend his actions. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, and the energy shifted when Michelle rose to present her argument. She took a deep breath and stood tall, projecting confidence that had come from years of navigating the complexities of the legal system. Michelle had always been accustomed to presenting tough cases and standing up for her clients, but today felt different. This wasn't just about a legal dispute. It was about the fundamental right to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of who you were or where you came from. In her opening statement, Michelle didn't focus solely on the fine or the courtroom procedure. She highlighted the broader issue at hand, the deep-rooted biases that were preventing people from being seen for their expertise and experience. She explained how Judge Harris had disregarded her position and her leadership in the legal community, reducing her to a mere mistake rather than recognizing her extensive qualifications. But it wasn't just her experience in the courtroom that Michelle was fighting for. It was the respect owed to all women and people of color in professions like law, where institutional barriers still persisted despite decades of progress. Judge Harris' defense was predictable. His attorneys argued that the fine was justified, citing the specific rules that Michelle had allegedly violated. He presented himself as a figure who had acted within the boundaries of his authority and emphasized that his ruling was based on procedural matters, not personal animus. They denied any racial or gender bias, framing the case as a simple misunderstanding blown out of proportion by the media and public opinion. It was a classic defense, one that assumed that everyone in the courtroom could be measured by the same standards, regardless of their background or experiences. Michelle listened carefully, absorbing the defense but staying focused on her goal: to show that her actions had been professional, that she had followed the proper procedures, and that the treatment she received had been part of a larger, troubling pattern. She introduced testimonies from colleagues who had worked with her for years, all of whom spoke about her dedication to the law and her reputation as a leader in the field. They spoke not only to her qualifications, but to the ways in which others had dismissed her authority in the past, subtle forms of bias that often went unrecognized until it was too late. The turning point in the case came when Michelle called a prominent expert in racial and gender bias in the legal profession to the stand. The expert spoke about the ways in which unconscious bias could manifest in legal settings, particularly in interactions between judges and attorneys. The expert's testimony underscored that while bias was often unintentional, its impact was profound, and it could result in decisions that undermined the legitimacy of qualified individuals, especially those from historically marginalized groups. The room fell silent as the expert's testimony highlighted that Michelle's experience was not an isolated one. It wasn't just about her encounter with Judge Harris. It was about the broader issue of how women, especially women of color, were often denied the respect and recognition they deserved in professional settings. The expert made it clear that even well-meaning judges could fall victim to unconscious biases that affected their decisions, often without realizing it. Michelle's argument had landed with force. The jury and even some of the legal professionals in the room, could no longer deny that the case was about more than a procedural violation. It was about creating a legal system that was truly fair and free from bias. As Michelle concluded her statement, she emphasized that this was a moment of accountability, not just for Judge Harris, but for the entire legal profession. Her words were not just a call for justice for herself, but a call for a reckoning that could lead to real, lasting change. As she finished her statement and returned to her seat, Michelle felt a deep sense of pride. No matter what the outcome, she knew she had done something that was long overdue. She had exposed a truth that was uncomfortable but necessary. Now it was up to the court to decide whether they would address this truth head-on or allow it to slip back into the shadows. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the final arguments concluded. The judge called for a short recess before delivering his decision, but the weight of the situation lingered in the air. Michelle sat quietly, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. This wasn't just a trial. It was a culmination of years of fighting, both for herself and for those who had faced similar discrimination but had been too afraid to speak out. She had laid everything on the line, not just for the legal victory, but for a future where women and people of color would no longer have to prove their worth in a system that had been designed to dismiss them. As the recess ended, Judge Harris returned to the bench. The room fell silent as he began to speak. Michelle's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral, a skill she had perfected over her years of practice in the courtroom. The judge began by addressing the seriousness of the case. He acknowledged that while the fine imposed was indeed a part of his authority as a judge, it had sparked a larger conversation that needed to be addressed. He noted the extensive testimonies, the expert witness on unconscious bias, and the broader social implications that had emerged from this case. For the first time during the proceedings, Michelle could sense that the judge understood the gravity of the situation. Judge Harris hesitated for a moment, then turned to Michelle. "Ms. Johnson," he said, his tone uncharacteristically somber, "you have raised a crucial issue that, frankly, I was unaware of at the time of the hearing. It is clear to me now that the fine I imposed was not just an administrative decision, but one that had unintended consequences that extend beyond the confines of the courtroom." Michelle felt a surge of mixed emotions. This wasn't just about an apology, it was a recognition of the systemic issues that had been laid bare. Judge Harris continued, acknowledging that while he had acted in accordance with the law, he could see now how his actions could have been influenced by unconscious biases. He spoke about the importance of reevaluating judicial behavior and the need for constant self-reflection, particularly when dealing with issues of race and gender. The judge's words, though a recognition of the harm caused, were not enough to undo the damage. The fine, he concluded, would be waived. But the case wasn't just about the fine. It was about setting a precedent for how similar cases should be handled in the future and how the legal system needed to evolve to be more inclusive and fair. The court's decision sent ripples through the legal community. The case wasn't just about one judge's mistake. It had become a wake-up call to the profession as a whole. Over the following weeks, Michelle received countless messages of support, not just from her peers in the legal world, but from activists, community leaders, and ordinary citizens who had followed the case. Her decision to stand up for herself had inspired others to confront their own experiences of bias and discrimination. At a press conference following the ruling, Michelle spoke with clarity and conviction. "This is not about any individual judge," she said. "This is about creating a legal system that is just for everyone. We need to continue to challenge the biases that exist, both conscious and unconscious, and build a profession where respect and fairness are extended to all, regardless of race, gender, or background." Her words resonated deeply with people across the country, sparking conversations about the need for reform not just in the legal field, but in all professions. The case had ignited a broader movement, one that called for accountability and a commitment to inclusivity. Michelle had never set out to become the face of such a movement, but she knew this was just the beginning of something much larger. It was a victory not just for her, but for every person who had been overlooked, dismissed, or undervalued because of their identity. In the months that followed, Michelle worked tirelessly to ensure that the momentum from the case didn't fade away. She partnered with organizations that focused on diversity and inclusion in the legal profession, advocating for reforms that would ensure more equitable opportunities for women and people of color. Michelle had set out to change the system, and while there was still much work to be done, she was confident that the world was finally paying attention. The case against Judge Harris had been more than a legal battle. It had been a fight for a future where all people could walk into a courtroom or any professional space and know that their skills and contributions would be recognized and valued. It had been the spark that would eventually lead to a brighter, more inclusive future in law, and Michelle Johnson had become a catalyst for that change.